Dose produces, above all, Art Zone. Gravediggers.
Hey everyone, we're back.
With another episode of Das Kriminal Podcast.
Yeah, and this one is we're turning back to the depressing side of our content mill.
Yeah, we try to sprinkle some lighthearted ones in there, but this is not one of them. Sorry.
We should warn everyone that there are warnings that we will be discussing violence, war, and sexual violence. So if you're not into that, then feel free to skip this episode.
Mm-hmm.
No hard feelings.
Yeah.
So by February of 1945, World War II was coming to an end. The Allies have successfully orchestrated the landing of British, American, and Canadian forces on the beaches of Normandy the previous summer, and are pushing deep into Nazi-occupied France, liberating town after town. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army had repelled the Nazis at Stalingrad in early 1942, and by now they've liberated Warsaw and are on the verge of taking Budapest. The writing was on the wall for the Nazi Reich. However, the memo did not seem to reach the German army, who were fiercely resisting, forcing the Allies to give a pound of flesh for every inch they took. Thus, on the 4th of February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Soviet and British military officers discussed the possibility of an RAF campaign to help the Soviet effort in the Eastern Front. Just over a week later, between February 13th and February 15th, 1945, the RAF and the USAAF, so the US Army Air Force, at the time the US did not have a separate Air Force branch, bombers flew over the German city of Dresden, dropping hundreds of tons of incendiary and high explosive bombs over the densely populated city. Incendiary bombs in particular caused widespread fire that ravaged the city. All in all, the attack resulted in around 25,000 Germans killed and many more injured. In the weeks and years that followed, the attacks on Dresden would occupy a central role in the debates over Allied war crimes and whether such an operation was militarily necessary at that point in the war. Dresden had served as a haven for refugees coming in from elsewhere in Germany, and so its destruction seemed doubly horrible. Worse, Dresden had become a rallying cry among elements of the far right, who to this day use it as a symbol of Allied brutality and thus the need for vengeance. Even now, 75 years later, debate rages on over Dresden. This episode will settle the debate once and for all.
Will it? We are very confident there.
I'm confident. I think my opinion is objectively right and everyone should follow my advice.
All right, well, there we go.
So before I get into Dresden, I want to talk about, the background to World War II, but it's World War II and we could do about 10 episodes worth of content on just everything to do with that. So it's going to be a bit of a history primer. Too Long Didn't Read bit about World War II. I'm going to begin with 1933 when Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, and at this point Mussolini is already Prime Minister of Italy.
This is going to sound a bit pedantic, but I really want to clear up a common misconception here. Hitler was not elected to the chancellorship. He was appointed by President Paul von Hindenburg. The Nazis at the time were a fairly popular party in Germany, and certainly the dominant force on the right. So I'm not saying that Hitler didn't have considerable support from the population, because he did. The Nazis never could have committed horrors like the Holocaust without the enthusiasm, or at least apathy, of a significant sect of the German public. I'm just saying Hitler's rise to power didn't come in the form of him winning a democratic election.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's interesting how a lot of people are like, well, Hitler won the election because he didn't. In fact, you're right, he was part of a fairly popular party, but he was also a compromised candidate to prevent the Social Democrats, who were at that point the leftists, from taking power. And he was, like you said, assigned by Paul von Hindenburg. I think it's interesting because once he took power, he obviously, abolished all elements of democracy, especially after the Reichstag fire. But you're right in the sense that even though he didn't win a popular election outright, to do what the Nazis did, the Holocaust and the war, it took considerable buy-in from, I would say, a majority of the German public.
Mm-hmm.
So at this time, Japan was also building its armies, and its goal was to establish an empire in East Asia.
Japan had already annexed Korea in 1910 and Manchuria in 1931, and Japanese occupation was absolutely brutal.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you want to read about that, just Google Nine King. What they did there was absolutely horrendous. But throughout the 1930s, Germany annexes Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland, which had a significant ethnic German population. At the same time, Italy takes Ethiopia and Japan invades China. Like I said, Google the rape of Nanking. You'll know what I'm talking about. And at this point, France and Britain are so weakened by the Great Depression and by the World War I that they're not interested in war. So they follow a policy of appeasement, basically giving Germany what it wants with the promise that it won't ask for more. On the 23rd of August, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union, who, by the way, the Soviet Union had been trying to form a military alliance with France and Britain and has been rebuffed. So on the 23rd of August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union sign a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And part of the pact results in, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland.
And kills most of my family in Krakow, by the way.
Yeah, my condolences. And I'm going to get into that a bit later regarding Polish refugees in the UK and their role with the RAF, which, respect. With the Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union ends up invading Poland from the east, and they split Poland in half between the two of them. And on that day, France and the UK declare war on Germany, having told Germany that if they invade Poland, they would declare war. On May 10th of 1940, Germany invades France, and it moves rapidly through the Ardennes forests, which German and British military officers had thought was impregnable to heavy armor. But the German tactic of blitzkrieg had rolled through the forest, as well as the supposedly neutral countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, allowing the German armored divisions to encircle the French Maginot Line and ultimately defeat French forces in a blink. And on June 14th, Paris falls to Germany, and they occupy parts of France directly, and they leave a rump state under the Vichy regime in the south. On the 22nd of June 1941, having taken France, Germany turns its eyes east, and it breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invades the Soviet Union in what is called Operation Barbarossa. And it launches a massive offensive against Soviet positions in Poland, pushing them back very quickly. And I just wanted to that point, part of Germany's plan from the very beginning was what's called Lebensraum, or living room, which is the Nazi ideology of ethnically cleansing Eastern Europe and settling it with German families. Basically, ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. And so they were bound to attack the Soviet Union sooner or later. On the 7th of December 1941, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it, a day that will live in infamy, Japan attacks the US at Pearl Harbor, and the US joins the war alongside the UK, France, and the Soviet Union in what are called the Allies against the Axis powers. And because the US declares war on Japan, Germany and Italy are compelled to declare war on the US because of, their alliances. And throughout 1941 and 42, Germany pushes Soviet forces all the way to the Volga River and besieges this Red Army at Stalingrad, where they make their last stand, while at the same time launching a ferocious air campaign against Britain in what is dubbed the Blitz. But by late 1942, the Soviet counterattack surrounds depleted German forces at Stalingrad and defeats them. And the Red Army now turns the tide and begins pushing the Nazis out of Russia.
Most Allied casualties were on the Eastern Front, so the Soviets bore the worst of it. And the Germans didn't treat the Soviet POWs with the same courtesy they did the Brits, Americans, and Canadians. Historians estimate that the Nazis killed about 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war out of a total of 5.7 million, so over half of them. In contrast, they only killed about 3.5% of American and British POWs.
Yeah, to go back to what I said, it's important to understand that Nazi ideology treated British, American, and Canadian people as racially, I don't want to say equivalent per se, but on a similar level, whereas Eastern Europeans were seen as targets of ethnic cleansing to make room for Lebensraum and to, eradicate them for settler colonialism of the German people. Yeah, it was brutal. I can understand why the Soviets hold a particular grudge towards the Germans as a result of this.
Mm-hmm.
In 1943, the Americans and the British begin a strategic bombing campaign against the Nazis, starting with the firebombing of Hamburg, which was a very important industrial city. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day occurs, which is the British, American, and Canadian forces landing on the beaches of Normandy in Nazi-occupied France to open a second front against the Germans. And this operation was quite successful, establishing a beachhead for Allied forces from which they can push further into France. A few months later, on the 4th of February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, which was held in Yalta, and which was a city in Crimea in the Soviet Union, Soviet, British, and American leadership in the forms of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sat down to decide basically post-war Germany's future in terms of splitting up Germany's territory, deciding who gets what, and how to deal with the administration of a defeated Germany. While this is happening, Soviet and British military officers discuss the possibility of the Royal Air Force organizing a campaign to support the Red Army's advances into Eastern Germany. Several targets were floated, which were all Eastern German cities that had heavy industrial capacity, as well as centers of railways that would link Eastern Germany together, and the targets would possibly disrupt German mobility. And those three cities were Dresden, Chemnitz, and Leipzig. And so a week after this conference, the Yalta Conference, on the night of February 13th, 1945, the firebombing of Dresden begins. It was initially supposed to begin with a wave of US Army Air Force bombers, but bad weather over Europe led to the RAF bombers being mobilized instead, because they were better at flying in cloudy weather. But what's interesting, and that's something I mentioned earlier, the RAF also included a lot of Polish refugees who were crews of these bombers. And those Polish crews were told of the terms of the Yalta Conference basically hours before the bombing. And part of the Yalta Conference included giving parts of Poland to the Soviet Union. And these Polish crews were so livid at that there were real fears of Polish mutinies. And Polish officers were relieved of their sidearms to, prevent that threat. But ultimately, the Polish government in exile ordered them to fly these missions, and they did without incident. You had waves of Lancaster bombers dropping flares initially to designate the targets, followed by a wave of mosquitoes dropping larger target indicators, which were these red smoke target indicator devices, basically paving the way for the main bombing mission, which at that point was organized by the RAF's Bomber Command, which sends 254 Lancasters carrying 500 tons of high explosives and 375 tons of incendiary devices. The first bomb drops at 10:43 p.m. German time on February 13th. 3 hours later, a second wave of attacks arrive for a double tap. So the first wave drops at 10:43 p.m. and it finishes at 10:58 p.m. 3 hours later, 529 Lancasters arrive, dropping 1,800 tons of bombs, with the explicit tactical plan of targeting rescue teams that would have organized after the first attack, trying to decimate rescue potential. And on the morning of February 14th, 1945, the U.S. Army Air Force joins the fray, and they send 431 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers to further attack Dresden. At this point, smoke could be seen about 60 miles away from the fires of the previous night, and some American Air Force bombers were sent with possible plans of attack Chemnitz and Magdeburg. But because the weather was still cloudy, some American squadrons got lost, and in typical American excellence, accidentally bombed Prague, Brux, and Pilsen. Between 12:17 and 12:30 p.m. at noon, American bombers dropped thousands of tons of further bombs and incendiary devices on Dresden. And because of the cloudy skies and the smoky atmosphere, the B-17 bombers had to rely on H-2X radar to identify their targets. And the wide dispersal meant that there was always going to be a chance of heavy collateral. So whether it was intentional or not, there was always going to be a lot of damage. And I want to quote a German survivor of the Dresden bombing who describes his memory. Quote, "It is not possible to describe. Explosion after explosion. It was beyond belief. Worse than the blackest nightmare. So many people were horribly burnt and injured. It became more and more difficult to breathe. It was dark, and all of us tried to leave the cellar with inconceivable panic. Dead and dying people were trampled upon. Luggage was left or snatched up out of our hands by rescuers. The basket with our twins covered with wet cloths was snatched out of my mother's hands, and we were pushed up the stairs by people behind us. We saw the burning street, the falling ruins, and a terrible firestorm. My mother covered us with wet blankets and coats she found in a water tub. We saw terrible things. Cremated adults shrunk to the size of small children, pieces of arms and legs, dead people, whole families burned to death. Burning people ran to and fro, burnt coaches filled with civilian refugees, dead rescuers and soldiers. Many were calling and looking for their children and families, and fire everywhere, everywhere fire. And all the time, the hot wind of the firestorms threw people back into the burning houses they were trying to escape from. I cannot forget these terrible details. I can never forget them. End quote. His name was Lothar Metzger, and he was interviewed years after. The immediate aftermath, of course, was grim. Researchers suggest that between 20,000 and 25,000 people were killed by this bombing campaign. That being said, in the immediate aftermath, Joseph Goebbels, the minister of Nazi propaganda, seized upon this opportunity as a, way of discrediting the Allies, and he claimed that 200,000 Germans were killed.
And still to this day, lots of Holocaust deniers have inflated the number of the deceased in order to frame the Nazis as the victims. So please, please don't buy into that.
Yeah, I mean, not just inflated the numbers. Some far-right people would call it the Dresden Holocaust, which I think...
Oh my God.
Yeah, as brutal as it was, I don't think it's fair to call it the Dresden Holocaust. It's just really... It's a ploy by the Nazis to equivocate, so don't fall for that.
Yeah.
So... Even though at this point the Allies were seen as good guys by a lot of people, there was a lot of controversy within the British and American press over this. The Associated Press called this a terror bombing, in quotations.
Germany didn't surrender until May 7th, 1945, but they were definitely losing the war at that point, and everyone knew it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see whether there was any need for this. And Churchill sent a memo to RAF Bomber Command, and he says in that memo, quote, "It seems to me that the moment has come whether the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise, we shall come into control of an utterly ruined land. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. I am of the opinion that military objectives must henceforward be more strictly studied in our own interest than that of the enemy. The Foreign Secretary has spoken to me on this subject, and I feel the need for more precise concentration upon military objectives such as oil and communications behind the immediate battle zone, rather than on mere acts of terror and wanton destruction, however impressive." End quote. So, if Churchill, the guy who says that we should gas barbaric tribes, is saying that, then, there's some issue here to be discussed. I do think it's interesting that Churchill was so hesitant because later studies did show that, or later, memos did show that he was also concerned of the state of Germany for the occupation in terms of, resources for the Allies during their occupation. So I guess it was selfish or self-serving in some way.
Oh, I definitely say it was.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest aspects of this is, of course, the civilian casualties in war and whether collateral is ever justified or at least accepted.
So Kurt Vonnegut wrote the novella Slaughterhouse-Five about the Dresden bombing, and I've seen people criticize what they consider a careless attitude toward the atrocities of World War II with Vonnegut's repeated phrase, "so it goes." But, and this is just my interpretation, I don't think Vonnegut was saying whatever about things like Dresden and the Holocaust. I think he was writing a very dark satire about how mass casualties in war just become numbers, and the rest of the world shrugged its shoulders and moves on, even in the face of horrific suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, remind yourself of people's humanity during war, or at least of the casualties that occur during war. I do think it's hard because I personally don't know how many of the people there, it's brutal, but it's hard for me to sympathize again because, it's Nazi Germany. it's hard because in 1945, the bombing of the cities was irrelevant to the war effort. Germany was all but defeated at this point. And even though the air campaign ostensibly targeted industrial capacities in terms of ammunition factories, airplane factories that were based in Dresden, the question that the Allies were victorious was when, not if. So I don't think there was a need for this type of attack. But at the same time, if this attack happened in 1941, for example, I don't know if I'd be as critical of it, because I can understand targeting not just, the industrial capacity of Germany in terms of factories, but in terms of a labor force of people who we would call civilians, because they weren't necessarily speaking military soldiers, but they were participating in Germany's production of military equipment.
Well, I think it's very fair to say, of course, if the situation was different, our feelings about it would be different. But the facts as we know them are that the Allied forces were closing in, and they did some of the most horrific bombing at that point in Germany and Japan, crucially.
Yes. Oh, the firebombing of Tokyo was horrendous as well. It's also, it's the whole, we've referenced this on this podcast a million times, but, the Mitchell and Webb skit, Are We the Baddies? Are we bad for bombing Dresden? And I would argue, though it was morally abhorrent and militarily unnecessary, much like I don't think the Allies can be considered heroes just for the good, I also don't think they're the baddies just for this.
Yeah, I do think it puts us in the uncomfortable position of criticizing a disproportionate act of violence against Nazi Germany, just as we criticize the US use of nuclear weapons in Japan. The victims of these attacks were citizens and soldiers of fascist states, and I don't feel any sympathy for fascists. But I think it's possible to condemn the bombing of Dresden as a militarily unnecessary act, basically meant to bully Germany into total submission, while still saying that the Nazis were vile fascists and I don't pity them.
I agree. I do think it's an interesting conversation to have over how culpable someone in Nazi Germany during the war is for, the Nazi Germany's collective crimes. Because, like we said early on in the episode when we talked about Hitler assuming power, sure, yeah, he didn't win a popular election democratically, but in order to conduct something like the Holocaust, there had to have been buy-in or at least apathy by a significant, even a majority portion of the German population. And I do think that there's a blurry line between a soldier of the German Wehrmacht in the front lines who's holding a rifle and shooting at Soviets or Americans or what have you. And then you have, for example, the radio operator who operates the radio to organize military attacks for the Nazi Wehrmacht, or someone who works in a German factory that assembles rifles or airplanes or whatnot, or someone who works as a truck driver or a train driver that delivers those assembled machines from the warehouses to the front lines, It's easy to say this one is a soldier and one is a civilian, and again, I mentioned this before the episode began to Aaron, but if this was something else, like, the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, I'm sure my opinions would be different because the cause of the war and the side of the war were different. But because this is Nazi Germany and because, there's such a clear distinction here, I don't know how abhorrent I would call this attack if this happened in a time where it was deemed strategically necessary.
Well, I also think we need to be very careful not to trick ourselves into thinking that the Americans and the Brits were specifically fighting fascism, because they weren't. If they were fighting fascism, especially the Americans, would not have had Operation Paperclip, where they recruited Nazi scientists into their own ranks. They would have prosecuted those people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, it goes back to Stalin trying to sign an alliance with Britain and France. And at that point, the British especially were eager for the Germans and the Soviets to fight each other because they saw Germany as a sort of, the Nazis especially, they saw them as a bulwark against Bolshevism. So the British and American animosity towards Nazi Germany wasn't an ideological antagonism towards fascism so much as a strategic calculation against an imperial rival.
So this is going to sound like a weird angle to take, but please hear me out, and a trigger warning here for discussions of sexual violence and rape. In the past several decades, feminists have examined sexual violence as a weapon of war. Second-wave feminist Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape goes into detail about how when the Nazis were in power, they sexually brutalized women and children from the groups they persecuted, like Jewish, Romani, and Slavic people. Then, when the tide of the war turned and Allied forces began liberating Nazi-controlled areas, some of their soldiers engaged in sexual violence against German women and girls. If we look at these sexual assaults as deliberate and targeted acts, which they are, of course, we see a pattern where the conquerors or militarily dominant class humiliate the other side with sexual violence. And I think that humiliation, that driving home total and utter defeat, extends beyond the scope of sexual violence theories. If we look at war, its long and brutal history, the worst of the violence almost always occurs as a conquering army takes control. Maybe human beings just have this sick desire to degrade their opponents in war that, if left unchecked, leads to these kinds of atrocities. I honestly don't know. But I do think humiliation, revenge, and the complete demoralization of a people can be motivators in wartime. And if we refuse to address that, we do a disservice to people living under colonialism, occupation, and other forms of military domination who are the most at risk for that kind of violence.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. I do think that's a very important point to make. I think it's interesting because up until very recently, with the advent of, modern professionalized armies and the sort of Geneva Conventions and laws of war and what have you, it was always understood, accepted, and recognized that a conquering army or an invading army will inflict massive amounts of violence on a conquered population. And I think part of it also goes to the sort of implicit deal between the leaders of a conquering army, the commanders, and their soldiers, because the soldiers get to suffer the ignominy of being part of a military with the grim marching and the crappy food and the possible illnesses and all that. And it's understood that if they survive all of that and if they achieve victory for their commander, for their king or emperor or whatever it is, then they get a few days in which they can loot and pillage and plunder and rape and kill and what have you without being, restrained. There's the Shakespeare line in Julius Caesar, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. It's common from Roman armies up through medieval armies that once a city is conquered, then you let them loose because that's the deal you made as a commander with your soldiers. You fight for me now and then you can go hog wild for a few days. And I'm not saying that's good or justified. I'm saying that I think there's a long history of after a war is won, after it's clear that a conquering army or a faction has achieved its strategic or is going to unavoidably achieve its strategic and tactical aims, there's a long, long history, like you said, of indulging in very excessive violence just to bring the point home, just to reinforce the point that, yes, we won and you lost and you're going to bend the knee and this is how it's going to be.
And there is a strategy there in driving the other side into complete submission, even in terms of negotiating a truce.
Oh, absolutely. And not just the other side, but making an example such that other people who may be watching or reading or listening will get the message that this is a faction or a country or an army you don't want to mess with. If they can do that to that population, I don't want them to do this to my population. So if they ever show up and ask for whatever, I'll just give it to them.
Right. And with that in mind, too, I really don't feel sympathy for Nazis killed in World War II, not a single ounce. They needed to be militarily defeated. I 100% believe that. But this was a message by the United States to other people, like you just said. This sets a precedent that if you mess with us, we will absolutely pulverize you.
Yeah, well, it goes back to our episode on the nuclear bombs. The nuclear bombs were at that point unnecessary, but the US wasn't sending a message to Japan, it was sending a message to the Soviet Union, because at that point it was anticipating the next play, which was the Cold War. It's hard because it's not ever said, but it's understood that these were demonstrations of American and British power to everyone that's watching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, puts us in the extremely uncomfortable position of not defending the Nazis because they are absolutely indefensible, but adding some nuance to the Second World War.
Yeah, exactly. And, it goes back to what I said earlier. If this happened in 1941, I'd be a lot less queasy about it. I just think for me, the big reason that I think this is particularly immoral is that it didn't need to be done. The war was just being cleaned up at this point, and the Nazis were on the verge of surrender. So why do it at this point? But if it was done at another point, then I would be a lot less queasy because, it's Nazi Germany and you need to defeat them in whatever way, shape, or form that you can.
Right. And a mass bombing campaign cannot target people of a certain ideology. Like, of course, children would die.
Yeah, and at that point, there were a lot of refugees from other parts of Germany that were fleeing the advancing Red Army. So, of course, they were going to cram into Dresden. And, of course, refugees include children, the elderly, the sick, the ill, and they're going to die. It's just hard to say, but it is. And it's, again, like we keep saying, I don't want to defend the Nazis, but I don't think a baby is a Nazi,
Mm-hmm.
Controversial
a baby,
take.
Right.
Yeah, controversial take that will get us cancelled. Babies are not Nazis.
Well, I think in any circumstance, sort of applying ideologies to like babies, that's ridiculous. And it lends to this very fucked up notion that people are born being fascist. No one is born a fascist. People are made into this, and it's horrible. But that being said, we can fight against it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think once you achieve military and tactical victory over a fascist regime, there's no need to indulge in excessive violence for the sake of posturing.
Right.
So on that happy note, we can wrap this up. I do want to mention that we have a Patreon for all of you wonderful listeners. It's patreon.com/dascriminal. And you get bonus episodes. You get our repertoire of past bonus episodes and a bonus episode coming this week, which is a heist, and we love heists.
This week? Oh, I'm not going to commit to this week. This month, people.
Okay, sorry. This month. I'm bad with time with the whole, COVID thing. But yeah, you guys voted for a heist, and we also let our Patreon subscribers vote because we believe in popular democracy, and we love heists. I personally am a big fan of heists, both real and fictional. My favorite genre of movies, in fact, is heists, and if there's any genre of movies that I will excessively delve into, it is heist movies. Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, Snatch, Den of Thieves, the Ocean's 11 series, Heat, Casino, everything, really.
Also, property crimes are just fun. Like when no one dies, great, love it.
Well, yeah, I know. And especially when they're property crimes against banks or things that are, it's one thing to steal a purse off a woman. It's another thing to steal $1 million from a bank that foreclosed 100 million people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
Follow us on Instagram too. We have an Instagram. It is @DasCriminalPod. If you have any concerns, questions, reviews, comments, messages of love and affection, send them to us on our Instagram messages. We love to read them. Please rate and review us. I know everyone who listens to us hates Apple and hates Steve Jobs and hates the algorithm, the Skynet algorithm that determines every facet of our daily lives. So please rate and review us so we could defeat this algorithm and move up on the recommended lists and podcasts.
Yeah, basically, when people search for topics, we really want them to find our podcast, because what if they like it and they come back for more? Wouldn't that be great? We really appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and until next time.
Bye.